Hello, this is Dr. Barbara Noel. I am the English language specialist hired by the U.S. Embassy in Costa Rica. This presentation serves as an orientation to the work that I have done in realigning and restructuring the English curriculum for cycles 1, 2, 3, and diversified education. My specific tasks were to align the English syllabus to international proficiency standards as defined by the Common European Framework. Specifically, I put together a scope and sequence called Goals and Outcomes to show the goals for each grade level and the outcomes of learning that are related to each goal. And this would then inform lesson planning and assessment, both at the formative and summative phases. My task was also to help train national and regional advisors. I did this specifically with unit planning. I then wrote several sample units and then trained national and regional advisors on weekly level planning so that they could in turn around and train teachers. The Common European Framework is the reference for using and scaling the goals for each grade level and the ultimate proficiency levels that are desired. The Common European Framework is also known as the Marco Común Europeo, or you'll also see in English documents as it is referred to as the CEF or the CFR. All of them talk about the same thing, which is a framework that describes proficiency levels based on accumulated evidence gathered over time from learner activities, tasks, or projects. Using the Common European Framework allows us to do several things for the English curriculum in Costa Rica. The CEF basically helps us to set a standard terminology among stakeholders, those being parents, regional and national advisors, um, students, teachers, and people in the education community at large. It also helps us to facilitate transferability across various settings in schools so that a student moving from, for example, Guanacaste to Turrialba will be able to have the same information work in both areas so that the teachers can know what proficiency level they're at and what kinds of behaviors they should expect the student to be able to do. It can also be used to track student progress across time. It also helps to provide descriptors for teaching, learning, and assessment so that teachers know exactly what are the goals and the outcomes that they should be working with in their lessons. Students know exactly what it is that they're supposed to be learning through objectives, and both students and teachers know what exactly needs to be assessed. It also helps in aiding students to be more autonomous by being able to monitor their language growth and take personal responsibility for their language learning. It also gives parents a way to understand their children's learning activities and to discuss their child's progress with the teachers. You can think of the Common European Framework in the following ways. There are areas of general competence that we would like our students to grow in their competence in terms of learning the language and relating to others. These have to do with creating more openness to people that come into the country, um, other people from different kinds of contexts than they're used to. It helps them also, by contrast, learn about themselves and in this way help grow their intercultural awareness and competence. And this affects, again, then their ability to um, have sociocultural communication across various linguistic and cultural barriers. We also want our students to learn and grow what's called communicative competence. Communicative competence can be grouped into basically three areas: knowing the language, being able to do things with the language, and how it affects their being, how they are as a result of having learned a new language. The linguistic competence that goes under the knowing aspect um, also has general areas of what we normally think of as learning a language, which include things like listening, speaking, reading, and writing skills. These are what we call the linguistic competencies. So these include things like the lexical, like the word, the phonological, the sound system, the syntactic knowledge, that it would be more of the grammar, and the skills and other dimensions of language as a system, independently of the sociolinguistic value of its variations in the pragmatic functions. So that would be the aspect of the knowing piece of the knowing of a new language. Now, for the sociolinguistic piece, that refers to the conditions of language use. So, allowing one to be more sensitive to the social conventions of language. For example, the rules of politeness, norms governing relations between generations. How do you address an elder? That sort of thing. Norms for how to address various social groups, the linguistic codification of certain fundamental rituals in the functioning of a community, the social norms, if you will. And it also works with things like registers and dialects and accents. The doing piece, how to do something with a language, is really what drives our wanting to learn another language, getting our needs met, solving problems to get things done. Um, that kind of um, language, those language functions are the ones that drive us to learn another language beyond the sociocultural piece. And those are also concerned with speech acts. So how do we inform? How do we ask for information? How do we ask for clarification? That sort of thing. Um, it concerns mastery of discourse and the cohesion and coherence of language, the identification of text types, what we would normally call genres. Um, those are what we would think of as the pragmatic functions of language, what we do with the language. And again, the psychosocial piece of the general competence works with the emotional, affective, cognitive, and social disposition and capacities in communication. So this is what when we want to think of, again, I'll reiterate, social dispositions and capacities for communicating with others. And the sociocultural piece have to do with the relationship between one's own and the target community's world, the intercultural competence of language. Now, when people start to look at the Common European Framework, um, quite often they'll ask, why doesn't the CEF talk about things like grammar and vocabulary? Oh, well, if the CEF doesn't really prescribe the types of grammar that students need to learn, maybe that should not be included. And that's actually a myth. The CEF does, the folks at the Council of Europe and the language department do definitely want us to teach grammar and vocabulary, but they don't define them or give word lists because each of these features reflect the language expectations within specific environments and cultural contexts. What the CEF does not want to do is to prescribe things so tightly that they become culturally biased. We don't want a Eurocentric curriculum, for example, in Costa Rica. We want a more Costa Rican context when we want our students to learn English. So that is why the guidelines from the Council of Europe state that things like grammar and vocabulary need to be defined by the curriculum planners and the teachers that are closer to the locality so they can personalize their vocabulary and grammar expectations to suit place, time, location, purpose, and context. Many of you may be familiar with the general proficiency levels for that the Common European Framework outlines. For cycles 1 and 2, we have gone ahead and defined that for those two cycles, we will work with levels A1 and A2. These are very general descriptions, but we will start with the A1.1 level, where we get students to understand familiar words and very basic phrases to satisfy very personal needs, very much here and now kinds of information. They'll be able to make simple introductions, answer sort of yes/no questions, state things like their name, their age, where they are, a little bit about their family members. They can interact in very simple ways, and also relying on the person speaking with them to have a very clear, slow pace of speech. Then they will gradually gain competence and rise to an A2.1 level, and then finally an A2.2 level. At that point, they're moving from the word level to some phrase, simple sentence level information where they can communicate about simple routine tasks. They can describe in simple language some of their immediate environment, interests, and activities, and they can use some simple structures accurately. But they will continue to show many basic errors, especially in terms of things like verb tenses, and use very limited vocabulary. We know that several things influence the rate of progress, and those are written here in terms of how fast students move on in growing their proficiency in English. Things like the learner age, amount of prior English language exposure, parents' levels of education and expectations, how close the first language is to the target language. So, for example, Spanish shares a lot of cognates, a lot of words that are similar to those in English, and by capitalizing on those, they can move a little faster in the development of English. But be it as it is, we also know that at the beginning levels of learning a language, we see that students can make pretty quick progress. But as they start to move to increasingly higher levels of proficiency, it seems like it takes longer and longer each time. It's kind of like walking up or hiking up a mountain like the Irasu volcano, where at the base it's pretty easy to make quick progress, but as it gets steeper, closer to the summit, it seems to take longer and it's more arduous. So we know that it will take more hours to move from, for example, an A2 to a B1 and a B2 to a C1 than it was at the very beginning levels. For this reason, we've gone ahead and decided to put a certain amount of time per each grade level for each proficiency level. The Common European Framework gives some general guidelines for how many instructional hours it takes to move from an A1 level to an A2 level. We also know that that most schools teach a minimum of 3 lessons or up to 5 weekly lessons that would equal to anywhere between 2 to 3.3 hours weekly over 41 weeks a year, which comes out to 80 to 136 instructional hours each year. So knowing that there are various factors that influence the rate of progress, we decided that grades 1 through 3 for a total of 408 hours, it would be we would have the students at an A1 level, and then the same would be true for the A2 level for grades 4, 5, and 6. This ends part 1 of the video. We'll move on to part 2 of the second video in the series.